Good afternoon. What I want to do today for a few minutes is take a somewhat broader look at the Middle East, but also to focus in quite particularly on the peace process between Palestinians and Israelis, and to look at this through the prism of American politics and diplomatic choices. I do this not because of a exalted role that I assume the United States has, but rather having spent a professional lifetime working on American diplomacy and having seen the degree to which concerted, dedicated, driven American diplomacy can achieve results in the Middle East, we're at a moment where it is useful to see whether or not that kind of diplomacy both is available and whether it will fit into a receptive environment for advancing the prospects for peace in the Middle East. Much of what I will say this afternoon will actually center around the question of leadership. Whether or not the parties to the conflict itself, President Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, and President Barack Obama of my own country, have those characteristics of leadership, determination, creativity, political strength and sustainability to move this conflict from a position where it has been for some years of what I would call latency. In other words, there is a prospect for actually solving this dispute and moving it towards an agreement. Looking at Barack Obama first, I think it would be fair, even at this early stage in what he expects to be an 8-year presidency, to call him something of a potential transformative hybrid as a leader. He certainly came into office with deficiencies with respect to a lack of experience in the foreign arena. He came into office with somewhat of a lack of experience in the executive arena as well, having spent his previous career in community politics and the legislative branch of our government. And yet he also entered office with a very sophisticated understanding of what it was that the United States was involved in the Middle East, and what the United States could accomplish by bringing together the various strands of our policy with respect to Iran, Iraq, the war against terrorism, and the Arab-Israeli conflict, and how we might use this coming together of these issues in a transformative way. I call it a transformative hybrid because we've also seen a degree of hesitancy on the part of the Obama administration in these first 20 months, which suggests not so much a dynamic, revolutionary transformation that's underway, but a rather more cautious and in some respects even hesitant approach to the resolution of issues which the President has defined as being of critical importance to the United States as well as to the security of the global community. What's interesting in this period is the degree to which this President, in fact, has at least rhetorically, verbally, articulated what I would call this sophisticated understanding of the Middle East. You recall during the 8 years of the presidency of George W. Bush, there was a sense among American policymakers within that administration that Middle Eastern problems could be handled sequentially by the United States. Back in the early part of this century, in fact, an official who was to become one of our Defense Department senior officials wrote a rather seminal piece in Foreign Affairs in which he argued that the road to Jerusalem ran through Baghdad. This was in 2002, before the American invasion of Iraq. The suggestion being that it was not the resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict that would lead to a resolution of other problems in the region, but rather the reverse, that if the United States could somehow foster or bring about transformation in societies in the Middle East, bring about democratic change, the end of authoritarian and autocratic leadership, solve some of the region's economic and social issues, then the Arab-Israeli conflict would be resolvable and perhaps even resolve itself. The road to Jerusalem running through Baghdad, meaning you had to go to Baghdad first. And this became, in some ways, a slogan that was to characterize the approach of the Bush administration in dealing with Middle East issues. If one tried to develop a similar slogan in this administration, it might be that there are many roads to resolving issues in this conflict, no one of which is going to be determining in and of itself, but all of which have to be traversed almost simultaneously in order to reach successful outcomes. And so Obama has fulfilled or begun to fulfill a campaign promise to withdraw American forces within a reasonable time from Iraq. That's on its way, despite some setbacks that have been experienced with respect to internal Iraqi politics. Obama has, at the same time, made good on a campaign promise to focus on what he considered to be the important war, and that is in Afghanistan. Whether one agrees or disagrees with the approach that the United States is following now, it is certainly consistent with what Obama told the American people in the world that he was going to do, which was to focus American attention not on the sideshow of Iraq, but rather on the critically important arena of Afghanistan. And Obama has made good on a campaign pledge to give priority and precedence, in fact, to the search for peace in the Middle East. Not because that was going to unlock the door or doors to the resolution of these other issues, but rather because of an understanding that the degree to which the United States is engaged in trying to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict is largely the degree to which Arab states and Arab publics will give the United States some room, both time and space, to deal with other pressing problems in the region. In other words, when the United States is not engaged in peacemaking in the Arab-Israeli arena, we have a harder time in mobilizing support from the Arab world for everything else that we do. When we are engaged in peacemaking, whether or not we're successful, Arab states find that they have the ability to persuade their own publics and their own political systems to lend support to United States goals elsewhere in the region. And so it's in that context that this administration in Washington started out literally on day one with an approach to resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict that was actually quite stunning. On day one of this administration, President Obama, as you recall, traveled to the State Department to announce the appointment of former Senator George Mitchell as special envoy. And perhaps even more important than the appointment was the statement that accompanied it, in which the President said that the resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict is a vital American national security interest. Not a favor that we do for the parties, not a substitute for the responsibility of the parties themselves to resolve their dispute, but rather important for us, for the interests of the United States in this region. Now, the President, in making this determination early on in the administration, could hearken back to some successes that his predecessors had experienced in peacemaking. As you recall, in the 1970s, following the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, the diplomacy of Henry Kissinger led to some quite important agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria that represented in some ways a foundation upon which subsequently in that same decade, President Jimmy Carter was able to help the parties, Israel and Egypt in particular, reach agreement both at Camp David in 1978 and then the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty in 1979. Fast forwarding the clock to the period right after the Gulf War in 1990-91, President George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State, James A. Baker, used the bounce provided by the success of the international coalition in Iraq to bring about a path-breaking conference in Madrid in 1991 that led to the shattering of some very critical taboos in the Middle East. It's a conference that took place without the participation of the PLO, but with the participation of almost every Arab state. It's a conference that resulted in direct bilateral negotiations, but also gave rise to multilateral negotiations on issues that are quite pressing in the Middle East: economics, water, environment, regional arms security, issues that had not been addressed because of the barrier presented by the Arab-Israeli conflict, and yet became a part of the peace process after 1991. So Obama, in launching what he hoped would be a period of successful American diplomacy to help the parties bring about a resolution of the conflict, could look back to periods of somewhat of great success, I should say, in American diplomacy, but also needed to learn lessons from periods of significant American failure in the peace process. And Tony introduced me with his kind words. He made note of a book that I co-authored in which Scott Lesensky and I and our study group at the United States Institute of Peace examined the last 18 years to see why, despite U.S. efforts to work productively on the peace process, we had failed. In fact, it's even worse than failure. We described a situation in the 1990s which can only be described as the opposite of a perfect storm. Perfect storm is when everything conceivable can go wrong at the same time and at the same place. And in the early 1990s, you had almost the exact opposite of a perfect storm. You had the end of the Cold War, which transformed not just the global environment, but the regional environment for peacemaking. The United States and Russia, the successor state of the Soviet Union, became co-sponsors of the Madrid Peace Conference. You had the Gulf War, which was not only important in reversing Iraq's aggression against Kuwait, but represented the first time that Arab states voted, both in the Arab League and then on the battlefield, to join a Western coalition in a fight against another Arab country. Two Syrian divisions and two Egyptian divisions and a Syrian division joined with the international coalition to turn back Iraq's aggression against Kuwait. You had a Palestinian Intifada which transformed the Palestinian-Israeli arena from one that had been dominated by Israeli PLO interaction, either from up close or from a distance, into Israeli-Palestinian interaction on the ground in the occupied territories. And while one cannot say many good things about an interaction in which so many people were killed and injured, the fact is that it became far easier to start dealing with the Palestinian issue with an empowered local leadership in the West Bank and Gaza, able to influence PLO policy as much as be influenced by PLO policy. And the fourth element in this perfect storm, in addition to the Madrid conference itself, was the revolution in Israeli internal politics with the election in 1992 of Yitzhak Rabin replacing Yitzhak Shamir, a hardline prime minister from the Likud party. So you had the coming together of these extraordinary changes in the international, regional, and local environment. And yet 18 years later, here we are trying to relaunch a peace process, looking back on 18 years of failure. And so Obama had to look not just to the successes of American diplomacy, but also to the failures and the weaknesses. And one good place to have started a year and a half ago in this search for answers would be to look at something that two quite far-reaching leaders in this region made clear in their actions and policies. In '92, when Rabin became Prime Minister of Israel, he traveled to Washington and he told President George H.W. Bush that it was imperative for Israeli national security for there to be a comprehensive peace between Israel and the Arabs. Now, many of you know or have read about Yitzhak Rabin. He was not a charter member of Peace Now. This was a very hardened military leader. He had been hardened in battle throughout his life. What he knew was war and conflict. And yet Rabin also understood that to preserve Israel's security in the long term, one needed to look not only at today's issues, but the challenges that Israel would face over the horizon, both in time and space. And Rabin understood that the real challenge, the existential challenge to Israel's long-term well-being, would come not from the Arab neighbors of Israel, but from Iran. And so in 1992, Rabin said to George H.W. Bush, Rabin, wanted this peace process to succeed, to lift the weight of the Arab-Israeli conflict off Israeli shoulders in order to focus on the threat to Israeli security that will be posed by Iran over time. Quite prescient in 1992 from what we know today in 2010. Well, 10 years later, the same exact attitude was manifest in the decision by Saudi King Abdullah to bring forth what has now become known as the Arab Peace Initiative. It represented a fundamental, I would even call it a cosmic shift in Arab state policy from an approach which essentially had previously focused on the question of whether or not the events of 1948, i.e. the creation of the State of Israel, needed to be undone in order to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, to a position adopted by the Arab states in 2002 that said that the events of 1967, in other words, Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, ultimately its occupation also of the Golan Heights in Syria, needed to be undone in order for there to be peace and security in the region. And this was and remains a cosmic shift in Arab behavior because it opens up a pathway for resolving the Arab-Israeli dispute that had not existed previously. And it derives, as it derived in 2002, from Arab understanding that the threat to their security also came not from Israel, but from Iran. So you have two pillars, an Israeli and an Arab pillar, on which to make an assessment in 2010 that not only is it intrinsically important for its own purposes to resolve this dispute, but it's important for the larger purposes of securing a region against the possibility of Iranian, whatever you want to call it, hegemonic ambitions or Iranian security threats to the region, for the Arab-Israeli conflict to be resolved. It's against that backdrop that I, in this case, have to express some surprise and even a little disappointment that the ambitious approach articulated by President Obama some 20 months ago has not been followed through with the kind of ambitious, creative, determined, presidentially led diplomacy that can make a difference in this conflict. Too much time has been spent on essentially procedural issues, and too much time has been spent, in my view, on trying to change behaviors, changing of which is quite important, but trying to change behaviors without establishing a strategic context for doing so. And let me make clear what I mean by this. Some of you may have seen articles I have written in which I have been very critical of Israel's policies on settlements. I've also written critically about Palestinian failure to deal with terrorism that emanates from Palestinian groups or from the incitement that continues in Palestinian textbooks and public media. These behaviors are extraordinarily important and need to change in order for a context for peacemaking to be created. But changing behaviors apart from having a strategy that encompasses a variety of diplomatic tasks is no substitute for having that strategy. It's no substitute for understanding how to make negotiations at least start off properly, if not succeed effectively. For being able to bring in additional partners into the peacemaking process, the Arab states, to see if they will actualize and implement the Arab Peace Initiative in conjunction with progress toward peacemaking. To bring in other outside parties, the European Union, countries that have interests and recognize their interests in the Middle East and have something to offer. Ways in which to continue to build Palestinian institutions and the Palestinian economy so that when the peace process does succeed, a Palestinian state can come into being that will not be a failed state. A way to deal with the issues of historical narrative, the two constituencies that are probably going to be the most difficult to deal with in the context of a final settlement. Refugees in the Palestinian community and settlers in the Israeli community have had no role whatsoever in peacemaking. And the narratives that they are bringing within the context of internal dialogue within their respective societies need to be dealt with. Conversations need to be started now with these communities in order to condition them to changes that they may confront as a peace agreement looms closer. So there's a need for a strategy which has been much larger, much more extensive, and much more intensive than what I would call the tactical approach adopted thus far by the Obama administration, an approach that looks a little bit like moving from tactic to tactic, trying to get a settlements freeze, trying to get an Arab gesture toward Israel, trying to work on proximity talks, and now, in the last month or so, trying to use the process of direct talks between Palestinians and Israelis as a means of achieving the purposes of this peace process. Now, the 3 or 4 questions that get raised at this point are germane to the larger analysis. The first question is this a process which is important? Can't the Arab-Israeli conflict be managed over a long period of time? After all, it's been 40 plus years since Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. There have been an eruption of violence now and then, including a rather serious confrontation as recently as 2008, 2009. But in the large context of global military and political affairs, this is, as one of my friends in the United States calls it, a small war among tribes who don't necessarily occupy that large a space on the world stage. Is it possible to manage this conflict? And I would suggest the answer to that question is no. That in the long term, there, number one, is no substitute for a two-state solution. There hasn't been a substitute for a two-state solution since even before the creation of the State of Israel. And secondly, crises and conflicts such as this one don't get managed over long periods of time without deteriorating. We thought that things couldn't get worse after the first Intifada in the late 1980s, and they did get worse in the second Intifada. There are some who believe that the second Intifada showed the worst that can happen. Well, things got worse just 2 years ago when Israel and Hamas fought a very bloody confrontation in Gaza and in the southern part of Israel. And so we don't know what a next confrontation would look like, what the next stage of interaction militarily would look like between these two sides. But the one thing that can almost be guaranteed is it's not going to be pretty, and it will not be controlled or managed easily. Second question is, does a solution present itself? Is it possible that there is no solution to this conflict? Well, I would argue just the opposite. We have seen in public opinion polls in both Israel and in Palestinian society for many years an acute degree of understanding on the part of the publics in these two societies about the overall shape of a final settlement. Nobody quite knows exactly the way the border will run. Nobody knows what the security arrangements will look like. Nobody knows exactly how to solve issues such as Jerusalem and refugees. But when public opinion polls have been taken in both of these societies, and they've asked general questions about, are you ready for territorial compromise? Are you ready to compromise on the so-called right of return of Palestinian refugees? Are you ready to share Jerusalem in the context of having a partner for peace? The publics in both societies have been smarter than their leaders, because they have always said, yes, they're ready for difficult compromises. They've also been tough in their responses to violence from the other side, because neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians want to allow a situation in which they become the object of violence perpetrated by the other side without inflicting some pain of their own. But in those same public opinion polls, time and time again, something that I discussed when I was the U.S. ambassador in Israel with then Prime Minister Sharon, we would laugh at these results because they were ironic and seemingly internally contradictory. The same people who argued for tougher military responses to violence were also ready for very significant compromises if those compromises presented themselves in the context of another party ready for peacemaking. So the answer to the second question, do solutions present themselves? The answer is yes. 10 years ago, then President Bill Clinton presented a set of parameters within which he suggested the parties negotiate. They didn't accept those parameters while he was president, But literally, the week after he left office, Israelis and Palestinians went to an area called Taba in Egypt, and they began negotiating on the basis of the Clinton parameters. As recently as 2008, Prime Minister Olmert of Israel, President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, negotiated quite extensively, basically on the basis of the Clinton parameters. You've had principles agreed between Israelis and Palestinians. Sari Nusseibeh, the president of Al-Quds University, Ami Ayalon, a former director of the Israeli Internal Security Service, developed a set of principles and got hundreds of thousands of people on both sides of the divide to ascribe to those principles. Israelis and Palestinians outside of government developed an entire peace treaty and annex in the so-called Geneva Initiative, in which they tried to play the role of government in trying to develop solutions to these seemingly intractable problems. So the answer to the second question is yes, there are solutions and they're possible. And the answer to the third question being, are leaders ready to make the necessary compromises? This is where we run into the question mark that I posed, or the question that I posed at the outset of these remarks. You have a situation which, even in the distressful times of 2010, remains what I would call ready for an ambitious, well-structured, and well-led peace process. And the question was whether or not, on all sides of the divide, Palestinian, Israeli, American, and international, there is a readiness to go beyond the comfortable, to go beyond the familiar, and to reach beyond one's own positions to try to meet some of the requirements of a successful negotiation. What might those requirements entail on the part of the parties themselves? And what, for example, might a U.S. proposal that might motivate the parties to negotiate look like? And I would suggest that without putting forward a U.S. plan or a U.S. Formal proposal, the United States can put forward ideas along the lines of what President Clinton tried to do that structure the negotiations so that they don't start from scratch, and that they don't wander, and that they remain focused on achievable outcomes. With respect to territories and borders, as Secretary of State Clinton has indicated, it is most likely that a successful negotiation on borders will essentially be based on the lines of 1967, with territorial swaps of a one-to-one nature, both in quality and quantity, that will allow for a minimal disruption of Israeli settlements, but maintain a principle in which Palestinians will end up with 100% quantity-wise and quality of the territories occupied in 1967. It is a doable outcome. Secondly, in Jerusalem, which many have suggested may be the most emotional and intractable part of this conflict, I have been part of a process, what we call a Track 2 process, with former Canadian diplomats working out of the University of Windsor, in which we've engaged quite intensively on proposals to resolve the Jerusalem issue. And what we have found from Israelis and Palestinians and a range of international experts is that there is a great deal of consensus with respect to how to resolve the Jerusalem issue outside the walls of the old city. It's in fact a place that can be divided by a border that would allow for, in a sense, two capitals for two states, a solution that would be largely based on demography, where Jews live in Jerusalem would become part of the state of Israel, where Palestinians live in Jerusalem would become part of the state of Palestine. The border will be squiggly and wiggly, but it's a doable proposition. And inside the walls of the old city, which is the most emotional, driven, religious-centered issue, the two sides can agree not to agree for the time being and work out administrative arrangements in which sovereignty is deferred and in which they agree that they will continue to deal with this issue over time, but not fight over it. It could be a solution that's far more in line with the religiosity of Jerusalem than fighting over religious space. Wouldn't it be nice to see our statesmen actually devise a solution in which we share these holy sites rather than kill each other over them? On the question of Palestinian refugees, they should enjoy a right of return, and it should be to the state of Palestine. There's no reason why Palestinians should enjoy a right of return to another state. This won't satisfy all those who would like to go back to the homes that they left behind that are now located in the state of Israel, but it will encompass a large majority of Palestinians, some of whom may also wish to remain in place where they're currently located, and consistent with the laws of the states in which they're now living, ought to be given the right to settle and gain citizenship, together with international funding for the settlement and resettlement of those refugees. And security measures ought to be intensive and intrusive and extended in time, because both sides will need to know that they're living in a comfort of a security arrangement which will assure their security even while they test out living together under different political and diplomatic circumstances. In this context, it may be for the United States to put forward these kinds of ideas to galvanize opinion both among the leadership but also among the publics in the region. It may be for the United States to continue afterwards an active role of trying to funnel the parties toward outcomes which are consistent with the desires that have been indicated in the polling in the two communities. And it may be up to the United States and the international community to be ready to open up very deep pockets to provide the kind of material support that's going to be required to deal with the various issues that need to be fixed as a result of this peace settlement, whether it's the resettlement of refugees and of settlers, whether it's the building up of institutional capacity in the Palestinian state, whether it's the security arrangements, which are likely to be in place for quite some time. There will be an extended role for the international community, both materially and in terms of personnel, in trying to make sure that this peace settlement can last. What does this do then for larger purposes? I tend to think in terms of larger American purposes. This remains my focus, even though I'm outside government. But it applies as well to you in Australia, because even though you're far away from this region, you have boots on the ground. And what happens in this region, even in the Arab-Israeli context, is critically important to the security of your forces and to the well-being of Australia and its relationships with the United States and with the parties in the region. What can happen as a result of a peace agreement and the effort to reach that peace agreement is to see a region in which we can then begin serious work on the other issues which have for far too long been ignored because of this barrier of Arab-Israeli conflict. The problems of economic development, the problems of legitimacy and succession and political instability within many parts of the Arab world, the growth of non-state actors, many of which are far more dynamic than state actors in the region, the weakness in the Arab state system and the growth of the importance of peripheral players or players on the periphery, such as Turkey and Iran, the degree to which political Islam is seen by so many in the region as the far more dynamic process than Arab nationalism or secular modernization. These are problems that exist whether or not there is a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and these are problems that I would submit would be far easier to start working on if there were a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So there's a lot of work to do. I hope all of us remain as dedicated as we have been in our respective professions to encouraging the parties in the region to do what's necessary and good, and particularly that we are encouraging to our leaders to take the right kinds of decisions, to act boldly, and to think strategically to try to bring about a peaceful settlement in the Middle East. Thank you very much.